Palestinians are being told the same thing as black folks in America. There is no acceptable form of resistance.
While only 18 members oppose Israel's oppression of Palestinians, many of those members spoke out on the House floor on Thursday, and I'm going to highlight a few of those speeches, including one that surprised me. So first up here, Rashida Tlaib, who's of Palestinian descent, gave a heartfelt speech on the House floor, and I want to share a piece of it with you.
We cannot have an honest conversation about U.S. military support for the Israeli government today without acknowledging that for Palestinians, the catastrophe of displacement and dehumanization in their homeland has been ongoing since 1948. To read the statements from President Biden, Secretary Blinken, General Austin, and leaders of both parties, you'd hardly know Palestinians existed at all. As long as the message from Washington is that our military support for Israel is unconditional, Netanyahu's extremism, right-wing government will continue to expand settlements, continue to demolish homes, and continue to make the prospects for peace impossible. 330 of my own colleagues, and Democrats and Republicans here, 75% of the body here, signed a letter pledging that Israel shall never be made to comply with basic human rights laws that other countries that receive our military aid must observe. You know, when I see the images and videos of destruction and death in Palestine, all I hear are the children screaming from pure fear and terror. I want to read something a mother named Iman in Gaza wrote 2 days ago. She said, quote, "Tonight I put the kids to sleep in our bedroom so that when we die together." And no one would live to mourn the loss of another one. The statement broke me a little more because of my country's policies and funding will deny this mother's right to see children live, her own children live without fear and to grow old without painful trauma and violence. We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid. We must, with no hesitation, demand that our country recognize the unconditional support of Israel has enabled the erasure of Palestinian life and the denial of the rights of millions of refugees and emboldens the apartheid policies that Human Rights Watch has detailed thoroughly in their recent report. I stand before you not only as a Congresswoman for the beautiful 13 District strong, but also as a proud daughter of Palestinian immigrants and the granddaughter of a loving Palestinian grandmother living in the occupied Palestine.
All right, so I'm going to link to all of these speeches that I include in this video below, so you can watch them individually. This speech was 10 minutes long, as I believe most of them were, and the entire speech is fantastic. Rashida Tlaib here, of course, has a personal connection to Palestine, and directly calls out here, as all these members do, the Biden administration for their inaction on this issue. And just to give a little context here, this week, Biden came out and said, I don't believe Israel has significantly overreacted to Gaza rocket fire. Yet here are the facts. Israel has killed more people in Gaza in the past 24 hours than Hamas rockets have killed in the past 20 years. And here's a visual representation of at least 2000 to 2020. Israelis killed 30, Palestinians killed 5,851. And of course, that number since that has increased. Now, the next clip I'm going to show you is the one that surprised me. Ayanna Pressley. So Ayanna Pressley, for at least the initial impression when she first became a member of Congress was that she was more defensive of the Israeli government than other members of the quote-unquote squad were. But if that was the case, she has since evolved on this issue quite a bit, and her speech here is great. But before I even get to it, while I was doing research on this, I found this article on Ayanna Pressley from 2018 discussing her position on Israel, and this is from a website that forward.com often is defensive, not always, but often is defensive of the Israeli government. I just want to read this quote for you to show you how completely backwards this whole conversation is. So here they write, Presley does reportedly back a bill that centrist pro-Israel groups, including the Boston JCRC, which is the Jewish Community Relations Council, don't love. It would prohibit U.S. money to be used by Israel for the, quote, military detention, interrogation, or ill treatment of Palestinian children. Look at the framing here. Here's an article critical of Ayanna Pressley, largely saying that she is in defense of Israel here back in 2018. But point out that she does support a bill that prohibits U.S. money being used to detain, interrogate, and ill-treat Palestinian children. And that's a bad thing. I mean, seeing a line like this should really help to open your mind to how the media, in general, the mainstream press, has used this issue or has communicated this issue in such a twisted and disgusting way. The idea that it's centrist pro-Israel, to be pro using U.S. money to interrogate, detain, and ill-treat Palestinian children, completely insane. Now, with that said, Ayanna Pressley, as I said, has evolved on this issue, and I'm going to play a clip of her speech here.
Palestinians are being told the same thing as black folks in America. There is no acceptable form of resistance. We are bearing witness to egregious human rights violations. The pain, trauma, and terror that Palestinians are facing is not just the result of this week's escalation, but the consequence of years of military occupation. In Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli government is violently dispossessing yet another neighborhood of Palestinian families from homes they have lived in for decades. We cannot stand idly and complicitly by and allow the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people to continue. We cannot remain silent when our government sends $3.8 billion of military aid to Israel that is used to demolish Palestinian homes, imprison Palestinian children, and displace Palestinian families. A budget is a reflection of our values. I'm committed to ensuring that our government does not fund state violence in any form, anywhere. Many say that conditioning aid is not a phrase that I should utter here, but let me be clear. No matter the context, American government dollars always come with conditions. The question at hand is, should our taxpayer dollars create conditions for justice, healing, and repair? Or should those dollars create conditions for oppression and apartheid? Now, while I hold space for the storied history and unique lived experiences on the ground globally, there is a through line here. And whether we are talking about the militarization of our communities or weapons of war, the question is the same. If our budgets are a statement of our values, what do we value? Whose lives do we value? We have seen footage of Israeli and Palestinian children huddled fearfully while rockets blanket their homeland. No child should live in fear. No child should grow up in the midst of a conflict that robs them of a childhood, and Palestinian children do not have the same protections afforded to them. Without the U.S. exerting pressure on Israel to de-escalate, the explosive situation in Jerusalem is igniting further violence, not just in the city, but beyond. It is clear there is a grave asymmetry of power here. Palestinians do not have a sovereign state and the protections that come with it.
So incredible. Ayanna Pressley here calling out the grave asymmetry of power, calling out the Biden administration, calling out the, as Crystal Ball mentions here as well in this tweet, Biden could stop this invasion right now by credibly threatening Israel's $3.8 billion in military aid. Failure to do so means blood is on his hands. Fantastic speech from Ayanna Pressley. I really was impressed by her. Again, I didn't know she was this well-informed on this issue, and it shows you here that she really has changed. If she was, more defensive of Israel 2 years ago, she has now become aware and changed on this issue, and we should be able to credit lawmakers for evolving on issues like that, for actually educating themselves and be willing to stand on the side of human rights. Now, last speech here. I'm going to play a clip from Ilhan Omar's speech, which again, I'll link to the entire 10 minutes below, but I'll pull out a few clips out of this speech, and just fantastic.
The truth is that this is not a conflict between two states. This is not a civil war. It is a conflict where one country, funded and supported by the United States government, continues an illegal military occupation over another group of people. This is not my description of it. This is the description of conservative Israeli leader Ariel Sharon, who in 2003 said, and I quote, "To hold 3.5 million Palestinians under occupation in my opinion, is a very bad thing for us and for them. It is an occupation, he said. You might not like this word, but it is really an occupation. For decades, the United States, the United Nations, and many Israelis and Palestinians have pushed for a Palestinian state in which the Palestinians can enjoy the same rights afforded to their Israeli counterparts. But in the past several years, that hope has increasingly slipped away. The Israeli government, under far-right ethno-nationalist leader Benjamin Netanyahu, has legally razed Palestinian ancestral homes, leveled entire neighborhoods, and violently suppressed any resistance. This is all to make way for illegal Israeli settlement outposts designed to displace Palestinians from their homes and prevent a future Palestinian state. When the 15-member United Nations Security Council proposed a resolution this week calling on the Israeli government to cease settlement activities, demolition and eviction, and urging general restraint, the United States reportedly blocked it from happening. We are currently blocking the United Nations Security Council from calling on ceasefire. And to this day, we as members of Congress have not had yet a hearing or a briefing on this conflict, or gotten answers on whether our weaponry or money is being used to commit human rights abuses.
So, an incredible speech there from Ilhan Omar, calling Benjamin Netanyahu a ethno-nationalist leader. I don't think we've heard those words on the House floor before. So, great job here. And again, also calling out the Biden administration and their inaction. This has been an ongoing issue, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. They have been in full support of the Israeli government, the oppressive Israeli government, while rarely ever acknowledging the amount of damage, destruction, and oppression and ethnic cleansing that the Israeli government has been engaged in for decades. Now, I want to leave you with a quote here, or first this tweet and then a quote. So, Farah Nabulsi here, who is just to get her title, Oscar-nominated and BAFTA award-winning filmmaker, tweeted out here, Israel's Iron Dome, most advanced rocket defense interception system on planet, is self-defense, flattening 30-story residential buildings, slaughtering children, families in Gaza, decades of colonizing and ethnic cleansing Palestinians is not self-defense. Those are war crimes. So this is so well put. Self-defense, often people that come to the defense of the Israeli government and their actions say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. You know, Gaza shot rockets in and Israel can shoot rockets back. Well, self-defense is shooting down those rockets with the Iron Dome. So Israel has that ability, with the help of the U.S. government, to shoot down rockets that are coming from Gaza into Israel. Gaza doesn't have that ability, but Israel does. That is self-defense. Shooting those rockets down is self-defense. Self-defense is not committing war crimes. Self-defense is not shooting, or is not launching airstrikes on residential buildings, killing children. That is not self-defense. So it's important we understand how certain terms are being used, are being manipulated to come to the defense of the Israeli government for actions that are ultimately war crimes. Now, there were more speeches here on the House floor that just didn't have time to get to, but AOC, of course, gave a great speech. Cori Bush gave a great speech. Mark Pocan gave a great speech. And actually, there's a quote that he referenced in his speech that I want to reference as well. It was fantastic. So he referenced Desmond Tutu, the South African human rights activist, who said, quote, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." So this especially applies to people in media, to people who should know better, lawmakers, people in media, where you have the ability to be educated, and if you still don't say anything, well, first of all, if you defend the Israeli government, of course, then you're also at fault here. But even if you're neutral, act like, oh, it's a complicated issue, both sides have their problems, then you are on the side of the oppressor. It is clear here, as I've said again and again, there is one aggressor, one oppressor in this situation. That is Israel. If you're not willing to call that out, then you are on the side of the oppressor.